It all started on a quiet Saturday morning. The kind where you'd expect nothing more than coffee, chores, and maybe checking on the barn out back. But things took a wild turn when the HOA's most persistent enforcer Karen marched right onto our property like she was leading a military operation. She didn't knock, didn't call, just barged through the gate, clipboard in hand, demanding access to our old wooden barn. Her reason? She claimed she'd received anonymous complaints that we were hoarding unapproved wheat stock. Whatever that even means. My wife had just stepped out to water the garden, and when Karen stormed up and demanded she open the barn, my wife calmly told her no. That's when Karen completely lost it. She pulled out her phone, ranting about violations, codes, and how she had full authority to escalate things. What Karen didn't know, though, is that my wife isn't just the quiet lady who plants tomatoes and bakes pea cheese, also the town's brand new police chief. And let's just say she doesn't take kindly to threats on her own front porch. But before things could calm down, Karen had already called in backup from the HOA, and within the hour, 2 more board members showed up. They brought bolt cutters, gloves, and cameras ready to bust what they thought was some kind of underground grain operation. They swung open the barn doors like they'd just uncovered a crime scene, and instantly recoiled. It wasn't wheat, it was dried cow dung, carefully bagged and stored natural fertilizer for the coming season. The smell hit them like a wall. But instead of backing off, Karen doubled down and blamed my wife for obstruction. That's when things really exploded on. Let's just say it wasn't just the fertilizer that hit the fan. Stick around, because what happened next, no one saw coming. Now, to understand why this whole thing spiraled the way it did, you've got to know the history between Karen and our family. She's not just some overzealous HOA board member. She's been a thorn in our side since the day we moved in. From writing us up for unsightly garden hoses to measuring the height of our backyard fence with a literal ruler, Karen's made it her mission to micromanage everything we do. But the barn, that's always been her obsession. She's convinced we're hiding something in there. Last fall, she even flew a drone over our property to peek through the upper vents, claiming she saw suspicious activity. What she actually saw were burlap sacks full of dried cow dung stacked neatly along the wall. Nothing illegal, just good old-fashioned compost. The funny thing is, we get that fertilizer from my cousin's dairy farm. My wife uses it for her community garden project, the same one Karen once tried to get shut down for attracting too many bees. So when Karen saw the barn door padlocked this time, she must have thought it was her moment to finally prove something. That's probably why she showed up with backup and cameras like it was a crime bust. But what made it worse was her complete disrespect for boundaries, both legal and personal. She ignored every word my wife said, refused to acknowledge her badge, and even accused her of impersonating law enforcement. You could feel the tension building with every step they took toward that barn. The air got heavier, not just from the fertilizer inside, but from everything unspoken between them over the years. And just when you'd think Karen would have had enough after getting a nose full of dried dung, she demanded my wife be investigated by the mayor. That's when things really started unraveling. The mayor's office didn't take long to respond, probably because Karen had already sent them an official HOA report, complete with blurry drone photos, a breakdown of unusual barn activity, and a claim that my wife had obstructed a lawful inspection. The thing is, HOAs don't have that kind of power out here. They can regulate paint colors and yard signs. Sure, but raiding private barns and accusing the town's police chief of misconduct, that's a whole different level. Still, the mayor's assistant scheduled a meeting to clarify the situation, and that added a whole new layer of tension at home. My wife kept her cool, like she always does, but I could tell this hit a nerve. She's worked hard to gain the town's trust, especially stepping into a leadership role usually held by people twice her age. And now she's being accused by the same woman who once tried to fine us for having too many solar lights. In our yard, it felt like an ambush disguised as HOA protocol. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down. She started rallying a few other board members who'd had their own petty grievances with us. One claimed our scarecrow looked too aggressive. Another said the compost bins made his dog bark. It was absurd, but suddenly it looked like they were building a paper trail. To make things worse, someone leaked the barn story to a local gossip page. Within hours, the post blew up, comments ranging from people laughing about Wheatgate to others genuinely thinking there was something shady going on. A few neighbors even started giving us strange looks at the farmer's market. One guy, who I thought was a friend, whispered that he never trusted barns that stayed locked. But behind the humor, something deeper was bubbling. Karen wasn't just targeting the barn, she was trying to destroy my wife's reputation. And the question that kept me up that night was, how far was she willing to go? By the end of the week, the pressure was at a boiling point. Karen had managed to convince 3 other HOA members to co-sign a formal complaint to the mayor's office, demanding a review of my wife's conduct, ethics, and handling of agricultural materials. It sounded ridiculous, but the wording was just official enough to stir up doubt in people who didn't know the full story. A town council meeting was suddenly added to the calendar, and guess what the top agenda item was? Community concerns over unauthorized agricultural storage and law enforcement misuse. Just like that, Karen had turned dried cow dung into a political scandal. My wife, calm as ever on the outside, started reviewing town ordinances and HOA limits after dinner each night. She was quiet, focused. I could tell she was working out a strategy, but even she admitted the whole thing felt personal now. And that's when things took an even darker turn. One evening, just after sunset, we caught the motion sensor light blinking near the barn. At first, I thought it was a raccoon again. But when I checked the footage from the trail cam, I saw 2 people figures in dark hoodies snooping around the back of the barn. They didn't break in, but they looked like they were trying to figure out a way inside without being noticed. We sent the footage to the local sheriff, but it was hard to make out faces. Still, it raised one major question. Was Karen involved in that too? The next morning, Karen showed up with a smile too wide. Rehearsed and casually mentioned to a group of neighbors that anonymous sources had reported a strong chemical odor from our barn. It was manure. Everyone knew that. But now, she was planting the idea that something dangerous might be stored in there. And just like that, the whispers started again. This time, they were louder. Something was building, and we could feel it closing in. Just when we thought things couldn't get more out of hand, a surprise visit from the county environmental officer pushed everything into chaos. Apparently, someone had submitted a formal request for an emergency inspection of our property, citing potential biohazard concerns related to stored agricultural waste. The officer showed up early in the morning, clipboard in hand, wearing gloves and a mask, acting like we were running some illegal chemical plant. And here's the real kicker. He brought a warrant. My wife, stunned but composed, asked to see the paperwork. Sure enough, the complaint was detailed, naming not only the barn but also the compost piles and even our vegetable beds. The language in the report was clearly exaggerated talk of toxic fumes, unregulated organic waste, and possible threats to public health. And though the report didn't name Karen directly, the phrasing was way too familiar. It was clear someone was manipulating county systems to make this bigger than it ever should have been. As the inspection began, neighbors started trickling in, drawn by the county vehicle and the flashing lights. Phones came out, cameras rolled, and all of a sudden, we were the main event on everyone's morning scroll. Karen, of course, arrived halfway through, pretending to be surprised and deeply concerned. She acted like she had nothing to do with it, but her smug expression said otherwise. She even tried to offer the officer background information, which my wife swiftly shut down. And just when the officer was about to wrap up the inspection, he paused. Something near the back of the barn had caught his attention. He walked over slowly, crouched, and reached behind a stack of bags. I followed his eyes and froze. It wasn't ours. A strange plastic container we'd never seen before was tucked just out of view. The officer looked up. "Did you store this?" asked. My wife and I exchanged a glance, because whatever that was, it had just changed everything. The moment the officer pulled out that plastic container, everything went dead quiet. It wasn't ours, neither of us had ever seen it before, and the label was scratched off like someone had intentionally made it hard to identify. The officer took a sample, sealed it up, and said it would need testing at the county lab. Karen stood nearby, pretending to be shocked. But I caught the way her expression flickered for just a second, like she knew more than she let on. Later, that afternoon, we got a call. The container held nothing dangerous, just a mix of expired garden lime and sawdust. Not toxic. Not illegal. Nothing even close to hazardous. But what raised eyebrows was how it got into our barn without us knowing. That's when the officer mentioned something that didn't make sense at first. The fingerprints on the lid weren't ours. My wife, being the new police chief, requested an internal check, and when the results came in, the twist hit hard one. Set of partial prints belonged to a man who happened to be Karen's nephew. He'd been in trouble before for trespassing. Now, it looked like someone had sent him in to plant fake evidence and stir up the drama, with everything unraveling fast. My wife held a town meeting. She laid it all out, the false complaints, the drone footage, the staged environmental scare, and now the planted evidence. People listened, and for the first time, Karen didn't have a comeback. Even the mayor was there, watching silently, his arms crossed. He spoke up at the end, saying there would be a full review of HOA actions and that abuse of authority wouldn't be tolerated. Karen stepped back, speechless for once. But just as everyone thought it was over, one neighbor raised a hand and said, "Quietly, you might want to check your own shed. Karen, my security cam caught someone sneaking out of it the same night those figures were near the barn." And just like that, the tables turned once more. The next day, the neighbor who spoke up shared his security footage with the sheriff. It clearly showed Karen's nephew sneaking out of her backyard shed with something tucked under his jacket just hours before the mystery container ended up in our barn. That was the final straw. With mounting pressure from both the town and the mayor's office, Karen was forced to step down from the HOA board. Her nephew was brought in for questioning. And though the charges didn't stick, the truth was out. People finally saw through the lies, and the gossip died down almost overnight. My wife, through it all, never lost her composure. The whole ordeal tested her more than any training or badge ever had. But in the end, she earned more respect than ever, not just as the new police chief, but as someone who stood her ground when it mattered most. The barn went back to being what it always was a place for storing fertilizer and garden tools. We even had a few curious neighbors stop by and ask for tips on composting, now that they knew the full story. As for Karen, she kept to herself after that. No more surprise inspections, no more drone flyovers, just silence. Her shed, the one that had triggered that last twist, sat locked and untouched. Looking back, it's wild how dried cow dung and a locked barn door sparked so much chaos. But maybe it needed to happen. The truth had to come out. And in the end, the real fertilizer wasn't what was in those bags, was all the lies she tried to plant. And like most bad seeds, they couldn't grow in the light. That's the story of how an HOA raid turned into a lesson in truth, trust, and standing up when it matters most.